Hello, everyone, and good evening. My name is Ron Hood. I am a co-chair of the CBA's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and I am an attorney at Bartlett and Grippy in Cheshire, Connecticut. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to Investigating Access to Public Spaces, which is part of the Constance Baker Motley series on racial inequality established by the Connecticut Bar Association and the Connecticut Bar Foundation. We look forward to continuing to explore topics related to racial inequality. Constance Baker Motley was a trailblazing civil rights attorney who became the nation's first African-American female to serve as a federal judge and later chief judge. Judge Motley was born in New Haven, Connecticut, and maintained strong connections to Connecticut throughout her life. Tonight's session is entitled Investigating Access to Public Spaces. This panel will dive deep into the history of discrimination in the Nutmeg State, looking at who was and who was not permitted to access our public spaces at the shoreline and more broadly through exclusionary zoning. We will look at how this was effectuated through the town ordinances, zoning, and case law. The landmark Supreme Court case in Leiden versus Town of Greenwich will also be central to this conversation. The panelists will also survey where we are currently today. So without further ado, I'll be introducing our panelists for tonight. First, you'll be hearing from Professor Andrew Carl of the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. Then you'll be hearing from Attorney Brendan P. Leiden at Wokel Leiden in Stamford. And then we'll be hearing from Attorney Aaron Boggs from Open Communities Alliance in Hartford. And last, you'll be hearing from Dr. Kalila L. Brown-Dean of Quinnipiac University in Hampton. So happy now to turn it over to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be able to speak with you tonight. And I'm going to talk about really the history of the state shore, the Connecticut state shoreline, and how it can speak to some of the larger issues about social inequality and how public spaces have factored into the struggle for equal access, not just when it comes to recreation and public lands, but also how that extends more broadly. Just let me pull this up really quick. So I'm going to show a couple slides here that will help us. So I'm the author of the book Free the Beaches, the story of Ned Cole and the battle for America's most exclusive shoreline, which tells the story of the fight over public access in Connecticut, focusing primarily on the struggles that unfolded in the 1970s and leading all the way up to the case of Leiden versus Town of Greenwich. And I think one way to sort of begin this talk is to recognize that the unique sort of legal and social history of coastal areas and the status that they enjoy as public land, one that is as old as the nation itself, and much older than that as well. You know, the notion of beaches as public land is one that really, in many ways goes all the way back to Roman law, as in this notion that these are areas that cannot be appropriated for private use. And that's something that then became enfolded into U.S. common law with the public trust doctrine, which stated that public lands were entrusted to the states for use by the public. And that is also here the case in Connecticut, where all land below the mean high water line is deemed to be public property. And through much of the state's history, and through much of the sort of natural and history of the Long Island Sound, this legal status of the coast as being public land really reflected its social use and an understanding that these were areas that belonged to everyone. And but that began to change really, and this is the history that I tell, beginning really in the early 20th century, when you began to see real estate development and growth in the state's coastal populations. And this manifested in a variety of different forms that you would see unfold in coastal development. And one that is particularly noteworthy here in Connecticut was the proliferation of what were known as private beach associations, which were essentially kind of early forms of sort of homeowners associations that were started by real estate developers, but in many ways, kind of reflected what we would sort of see as kind of private homeowners associations that wrote into their property deeds restrictions that barred certain groups from being able to live in these areas. And these were mostly, again, summer homes that were oftentimes, appealing in particular to certain ethnic and religious groups. And in fact, they kind of, that was often sort of written right into the property deeds that, specified, certain, restrictions on who could own lots there. And many of the private beach associations that, were founded and, developed along the shoreline oftentimes became associated with certain ethnic and religious groups, Irish, Italians, Catholics, and WASPs. And they were often, as well complemented by private clubs that grew along the state shoreline that also as well defined themselves as much by who they kept out and who could not become members as much as who could. And during these decades, again, we began to see this process both of development and privatization along the state shoreline, as well as segregation of space, and in particular exclusion of African Americans that was almost universal amongst these private beach associations as well as private clubs. Now, during these same decades in the early 20th century, we begin to also see shoreline towns growing in population. Especially their summertime populations. You begin to see families buying cottages in towns like Madison, Clinton, Guilford. And as these towns were growing, they were also beginning to provide more public goods and services. And towns began to acquire land along their shorelines and building public town beaches for their residents. And it's worth noting as well that, much of the residential property in these towns was also covered by restrictive covenants, barring the sale of properties within towns to certain disfavored religious and ethnic and racial minorities. And often outside, they would include clauses within those restrictive covenants that would permit African Americans to live in these communities as servants, in a servant capacity, but not as equals. And as a result, the Black populations of shoreline towns remained minuscule throughout the 20th century. And and as I describe in telling this history, these exclusionary practices in housing markets extended then to public spaces. And in many respects, you could see how exclusionary practices in other areas of public life would complement and reinforce segregation in housing. And one area that is particularly notable that I describe is the adoption of local ordinances that restricted who could access public town beaches. So some towns like Greenwich, Westport, and Fairfield adopted ordinances that explicitly banned non-residents from these public spaces. Other towns didn't enact outright bans on non-residents, but made it as hard as possible for them to access these spaces. So, adopting, fee scales that were much higher for non-residents versus residents, making it hard for non-residents to buy beach passes, or reserving the parking lots near beaches for residents only, banning picnicking on the shore. I mean, all sort of measures that were aimed at sort of, making it increasingly difficult for people who didn't live in these towns. And again, the property deeds in these communities ensured that these towns were pretty, racially exclusionary. Would also then, sort of be reflected in who was accessing these public spaces. And to be clear, I mean, these fees were not intended to kind of fund the beach's upkeep and maintenance so much as they were meant to make it hard for certain people to enter. And it's kind of fitting that we're, this lecture series is named after Constance Baker Motley, because as I describe in the book, I mean, she experienced this firsthand, going to a town beach that would otherwise, have, if she was, she was with, white friends of hers, and they, as a non-resident, if she was white, they probably would not have even batted an eye. But suddenly, when an African American was accompanying, then they invoked this resident-only policy, and she described that as really one of her first, experience, sort of a very visceral and memorable experience of racism that she described many years later in an oral history. And these restrictions were also not simply about making these beaches accessible only to local residents, because I found ample evidence that even in these towns where you had African Americans living in these communities, they worked to make these spaces as unwelcoming for Black residents of these towns as possible. I found an instance where the town of Madison, in the 1930s, led a push to ban domestic servants who worked and lived in summer cottages owned by white families from using these town beaches. Similarly, in the town of Branford, the African-American population there learned by word of mouth to avoid the public beach, even though, under the town's ordinance, they had as much a right to use it as any other residents. So the result with this is that even though there wasn't a Jim Crow sign to be found anywhere along the Connecticut shoreline, or anywhere in Connecticut for that matter, by mid-century, the state shoreline was just as segregated as any you would find in the South. And this is what the Hartford-based activist and community organizer Ned Cole, who becomes kind of a central figure in this saga, found when he began a campaign to help provide underprivileged youth in Hartford access to the state's shoreline through leading bus trips of children down to the beach, beginning in the early 1970s. And this was launched really as a kind of program just aimed at providing access and summertime activities for children living in Hartford's North End. But when they got down to the shoreline, Ned Cole and the Revitalization Corps, the organization he led, found that there was nowhere that they could go. That they would come to town beaches and promptly get stopped by local police, told that these were areas for residents only, and this led him to embark on a decade-long campaign to open up these town beaches and these private beaches to the wider public, and to kind of call attention to what he saw as a kind of class elitism and racism that were driving these local ordinances. He employed a variety of inventive tactics aimed at both calling attention to the injustice of these public lands that were inaccessible to a wide swath of the state's population, but also to as well sort of call into question the sort of legality of these ordinances, and also to sort of highlight the fact that everything below that mean high tide line was legally public land. So one of his tactics was to, if they weren't going to let them access the beach from land, well, then they would access it from the water. So staging these kind of amphibious invasions of the state's shoreline, aimed at sort of calling attention to these exclusionary measures, and in a sense, kind of using the sort of recreation as a form of protest. And these bus trips and this campaign, provoked a level of outrage that was unlike anything that these communities had ever experienced, and led to a prolonged set of struggles locally, as well as new tactics that were being employed by shoreline towns aimed at fortifying these barriers. Adopting even more extreme mechanisms of exclusion. And so becomes the sort of becomes a sort of issue that will continue to unfold, and ultimately it would be our next speaker here, Brendan Layden, who would challenge the strength of these measures in court and lead ultimately to the monumental decision regarding how towns could restrict or could not restrict access to public space. So I will stop there and hand it over to our next speaker.
So my role in this started when I was still in law school, actually, in 1994 in the actually winter time. I had started a jogging route with a friend who lived in an area, Stanford, adjacent to Greenwich, that wound its way into what was called Todd's Point or Greenwich Point Park. Um, and most towns that have restrictions have guards up and from Memorial Day to Labor Day, but Greenwich is particularly exclusive in their guarding. So their guard starts up in like March. So we were jogging. And at that point, when we came up to the gate, we had been jogging for a few weeks at that point on this path. Guy jumped out of the guard gate, remarkably aggressive, like we were trying to sneak into the Pentagon or something, and said, "Halt! What are you doing there?" And we said, "We're jogging on the road here into this park." He's like, "You're not allowed," or he said, "Do you have your beach pass?" And we said, "No. How do we get a beach pass?" "You have to have a beach pass for getting here." We said, "How do you get one?" He said, "Are you from Greenwich?" We said, "No." He said, "Then you can't get one." So at that point, I didn't really realize the significance of what was to follow. We just found a new jogging route. But then a few months later at Rutgers Law School in Newark, I was in a constitutional litigation clinic, which was a clinical program handling in actual cases. And one of the ones I worked on dealt with non-resident discrimination in parks. So I recalled my experience there and thought it'd be interesting to challenge the Greenwich ordinance. New Jersey has a much more developed body of law, and certainly did at that point, under what's called the public trust doctrine that Professor Carl discussed, which generally holds that these areas are held, although they're held by municipalities, are done for the benefit of the state and public at large, not as a proprietary thing. And so I decided to take on Greenwich and actually got it assigned as an independent study project for my last semester in law school. So in 1995, I brought the lawsuit. Started with the application for a temporary injunction. At that point, I was still in law school and actually had a contested evidentiary hearing, my first appearance in court ever, by myself against this team of attorneys on the other side. So it was a real trial by fire in terms of learning that, with a full gallery and like news trucks with cameras outside, and proceeded in the case. Ultimately came to trial in 1998, which also was something of an adventure. A couple things happened at trial. One of the issues that Greenwich claimed was that they didn't take any state or federal funding for this park, so therefore they should be allowed to do this. That issue ultimately didn't matter for what the court ended up deciding on, but at the time seemed like a very important factual dispute because it wasn't true. The only state and federal funds they hadn't taken were ones that were specifically part of grants where if you take this money, it expressly states you have to open up this area to the whole public. So they were kind of pounding their chest about we don't take this money. I was trying to show how they actually did take state and federal funds directly and indirectly benefiting this park, including a substantial amount for sewer treatment, which both help the water, which, as any of you have grown up in the Sound area from the 70s, it's a lot better now because there's part of a, I think, multi-billion-dollar program to clean up the Sound for sewer treatment plants, including sewer treatment from the park itself. So there was a witness who was an expert witness I disclosed who was supposed to testify at trial, who was part of this federal state like task force, who was a federal employee, who was going to be able to show how they actually got this money. I'd been talking to him the weeks and months before, and he seemed on board and wanted to help, and was going to be able to get this good information out. And like a week before trial, said, I need you to send me a subpoena because I'm working there. And I said, okay. And then during trial, the day before he was supposed to testify, I got a fax from a U.S. attorney saying that the subpoena against him was illegal under this federal doctrine that I found out about at the time, that basically federal employees can ignore state subpoenas. So my sole expert witness was not allowed to come to trial. I actually showed up the next day with a motion for capias of my own expert, trying to figure out how to get around this issue. Ultimately was able to get in the key evidence I needed, but it was an interesting struggle, and I think it was something behind the scenes of Greenwich pulling strings from the influence they had to try to cut me out from there. Another important witness at the trial was Ned Cole himself, who I also called because one of the issues was this Greenwich Park what's called a public forum for First Amendment purposes. If it was deemed a public forum, their ability to bar access to it would be very limited. But there was a dispute as to whether the case law, pretty strong in my opinion, suggested that any park and streets and sidewalks are deemed public forums. But there was an argument that only specific parks that had a real core purpose of free expression qualified as public forums, which really got that doctrine to just probably a handful of parks in the country. But that was a factual dispute. So Ned Cole, I want to testify about protests he led at the park to show it had been a venue for free speech activity of some importance. So he did testify. He was something of a character, and they call it untrainable witness. So I tried to do as much as I could preparing him, but he was going to say what he was going to say, and got into some arguments with the judge and opposing counsel that was somewhat entertaining, but ended up indirectly proving my point. But it was again an interesting experience. And then another witness was a partner at a big New York City law firm who owned a house on the water in Greenwich near the park, and started this Greenwich Point Preservation Association, distributing flyers and like doing advocacy at the park. So I had actually gotten one of these flyers and subpoenaed him. So this was a very hostile witness who ended up proving my point in his desire to stop it. So he was not very happy about his role in that case, but it was an interesting side note. And after the trial judge ended up ruling against me, found it was not that the public trust doctrine, he kind of said that's a New Jersey thing, that's not us. And also that he didn't think free speech was implicated because I wasn't saying that I wanted to go there on this day to talk about this topic or lead a protest or lead a parade at a defined date and time. Which was another strategic thing. I'd spoken to Professor Margulies at Quinnipiac, and he had suggested doing that if I wanted to really get anywhere with the First Amendment argument, which really was the argument I came up with myself. New Jersey had not done that. But my concern was if it was limited that way, then you'd have some municipal bureaucrat who you'd have to apply to first, who would then be deciding whether your issue was important enough for free speech. And it really wouldn't open the doors to these places. So I said, it's got to be this rule bars free speech by its restrictiveness without qualification for a win to do anything. But in any case, the trial judge said none of that was implicated because he didn't find there was any defined free speech purpose by general communication at parks, and that the restriction didn't impede that. I appealed to the appellate court, which ruled in my favor on what's really the simpler of the doctrine, something called the public trust doctrine, which has been discussed. And there's multiple components to the public trust doctrine. The sort of most familiar one is the land below the mean high tide mark, which Professor Carl has spoken about. But there's a corollary doctrine to streets, sidewalks, and parks that are also held in trust by the public. Most streets, sort of by mileage or square footage, or sidewalks are owned by municipalities. But they can't just say only our residents can drive on our streets or walk on our sidewalks. They're doing that for a national network of roads. And similarly, parks are held in the same status, which, I think was a good foundation but hadn't really been fleshed out a lot in the case law. But in any case, the Connecticut Appellate Court did agree with that doctrine and ruled on the public trust. Then that was appealed to the Connecticut Supreme Court, who initially denied transfer somewhat surprisingly, but they did take the appeal to the Connecticut Supreme Court. At that point, again, I'm fairly certain from Greenwich pulling strings, there was a amicus brief by the state Department of Environmental Protection. And initially, when the application came in for amicus brief, they didn't actually attach the brief. It was for permission to file it. I tried to talk to the attorney because it seemed like they were against my position, which, like I said, I suspect was strongly because Greenwich had influence with people who were trying to block it. But the attorney wouldn't talk to me and claimed it would be a conflict of interest to do so. I've sort of since learned that attorneys will often say conflict of interest to define thing I don't want to do. And so he was already had his mission. He wasn't going to talk to me. So the state of Connecticut filed a brief saying that allowing this case to succeed on the public trust doctrine would somehow harm the public trust doctrine as applies to the mean high tide mark, with no explanation given as to how or why that would occur. But for whatever reason, the Supreme Court actually bought that and reversed the appellate court on the public trust doctrine. Fortunately, though, they bought my theory of free speech and First Amendment and ruled that a park was a traditional public forum, and furthermore, that it didn't require a specific defined, I'm going to go and protest the war at this date and time, but just the bar of having non-residents go there and talk on day-to-day issues of conversation was protected by the First Amendment. Another interesting thing the Connecticut Supreme Court did, even after deciding initially on the federal First Amendment, I had also raised a state constitutional issue, which is always important to look at if you're raising constitutional issues, because particularly with our current Supreme Court, I wouldn't bank on a lot of expansion of rights going your way from this current Supreme Court, unless it involves guns. But for the other types of civil rights things, you're probably going to be better off under the state constitution. So it's important to look at that. And they did specifically say yes on federal constitution, but then also on state constitution. The net effect of that meant that Greenwich could not go to the U.S. Supreme Court under something called the independent state law doctrine. There would have been no basis for the U.S. Supreme Court to take it because the same result would have already stood on the state constitution, which they couldn't impact. So that ultimately resulted in a unanimous Connecticut Supreme Court decision saying that the park had to be open to non-residents, which got quite a bit of attention. Unfortunately, since then, and I think what we'll be talking about in more detail, the declaration that it's a fundamental constitutional right to have non-residents go to these parks was met with the municipalities trying to avoid the actual impact of that in any way possible. So they've done more restrictions to allow people from going there. For instance, at a time when you had to have a resident escort you, they sold guest passes at the guardhouse on weekends when you were going to the beach. You just had to be with a resident, but then it was like $6 for them to bring a guest in. And they were able to do that. After the Connecticut Supreme Court said it's a fundamental constitutional right to allow non-residents to do there, they no longer allowed guest passes to be sold at the guardhouse, but only at town hall during business hours, just to make it harder. I mean, there's no justification for that. They also had a differential in pricing for non-residents, which again has been done to exclude. I think all these are frankly subject to challenge, and we can talk in more detail later, but in New Jersey, those types of things have been barred, even under the public trust common law doctrine. So it's hard for me to think that if it's a fundamental constitutional right as opposed to common law doctrine, it's kind of hard to say these price differentials or other impediments would withstand a challenge, but it just, I've been kind of busy in my own practice, but it's something that may be worth pursuing further. So that's my portion of it. I would then pass it on to Aaron Boggs from Open Communities Alliance to discuss the broader issues as well.
Great to be here. Thank you, Brendan. I'm going to share my screen and show a few slides. One of the things to think about is in all of this is, how we take the notion of sort of exclusion from a right that might be part of what we should all be entitled to because it's shoreline, and how that extends into other rights that may be connected to where you live, and whether there are, the extent to which there are other barriers to that. For those of you who don't know, Open Communities Alliance, we're a civil rights organization working to undo the history of segregation by breaking down barriers to housing choices while supporting equitable investments and policies in higher poverty communities. So, beyond beaches in Connecticut, there are limitations on what people who are not residents of certain towns can do. And we can have discussions about whether town money is going into certain amenities. But the fact is, if you don't live in the town, you may not get access to them, or you may not get access to them in the same way that residents do. So I'm not trying to call out Orange or Milford or Glastonbury or Marlborough, because we could do this for lots and lots and lots of towns in the state. But clearly there are ways in which pickleball courts or beaches on lakes or walking trails or the local dump, which may actually have some really great things that people are giving away, are restricted to people who don't live in town. There are also things that could be, maybe even more important in some ways: access to swimming lessons, or in Glastonbury, you have to, you can get on the travel team for the club soccer only if you're better than people in Glastonbury. And there are restrictions to other benefits around certain classes and things like that. And Cromwell, again, picking on some places, but it really is just a matter of closing my eyes and putting my hand in the hat and pulling out some, because there are so many of these. And a bigger version of this, of course, are other amenities, things like how the schools are doing. So if you can't get access to a town, except if you're maybe lucky and get access to a magnet school, assuming you want access to a different school, you're out of luck, and or you get in through maybe the open choice program. And we see on this map how the school performance across the state really varies. This uses the State Department of Education's Next Generation Accountability Index to show schools that are really performing at a high level in the dark green, and then schools that are struggling and could use more investment and supports in the lighter shaded coloring. So obviously there's a big difference in the benefits you can get when it comes to education, depending on where you live. We take that to another level by looking at not only education, but also other things like access to employment, access to neighborhood benefits like safety and homeownership and low levels of poverty. And we do something called opportunity mapping, which is really intended to both help us understand where we need to make deeper investments and understand where there may be barriers that are preventing access to places that are really, creating lots of resources for their residents. So in this map, the areas that are dark orange are places that, for lack of a better term, we call very high opportunity, that have those high homeownership rates, low levels of crime, low levels of poverty, high performing schools, all the way down from very high all the way down to very low opportunity, which are areas where we need to generate opportunity with investments. And so it's very clear that we have some stark differences in our state when it comes to these kinds of amenities and benefits. So how does this connect to segregation? Well, I think people on this call are probably very familiar with the notion of redlining, ways in which home loans and homeowners insurance were not made available to neighborhoods, partly based on the race of residents, and that had a huge impact on wealth and wealth building and opportunity access for lots of families. We just heard Andrew talk about the racial covenant that was down along the shore. That exact language was used up in West Hartford. This is a racial covenant from 1940 in West Hartford. Same language: no person of any race except the white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race employed by an owner or tenant. Same language, and created huge problems with access to many neighborhoods all across the state and obviously elsewhere in the country as well. When it comes to zoning, the sort of quintessential case is Euclid v. Ambler. That was the case in which the US Supreme Court said, yes, towns, municipalities all over, you can regulate things like the size of lots where commercial and residential areas are, et cetera. Justified really on health and safety grounds, but we know that the district court case that led up to that Supreme Court case was clear about the full range of reasons, and maybe one of the most important that zoning was used for. And in that case, the judge said that the blighting of property values and the congesting of population whenever the colored or certain foreign races invade a residential section are so well known as to be within the judicial cognizance. So very clearly, this is baked into how zoning has been, how it has developed over decades. These kinds of policies, combined with other kinds of discrimination, have really been a big part of why Blacks and Latinos in Connecticut earn about half or less of what whites are earning and have about a tenth or less of the wealth. And the reason this is important, of course, is if we're talking about access to towns that are more expensive for a variety of reasons, that is going to be all the more challenging if families who are Black and Latino, on average, have less income and wealth to really acquire home ownership or even rent in those neighborhoods. Just to sort of connect this very clearly to race, when we're talking about families who are at 30% of state median income, probably in the neighborhood of about $30,000, $40,000 for a family of four, that's about 10% of white non-Hispanic residents. It's about 26%, 27% of Black non-Hispanic residents, and about 30% of Hispanic residents. So, this is sort of where the rubber hits the road. And then it connects to segregation. This is a map of segregation in the state with the darker areas, darker blue areas, representing a higher percentage non-white. We can see differences like, looks like one of the parts of this is missing. It fell off when I transferred this into PowerPoint, but 2% non-white in this Hartford tract, and I think the other one was like 75% white non-Hispanic in this West Hartford tract. See if the second one worked. So there it is, 75 for the West Hartford tract. So really big differences, and we see those all throughout the state. Fairfield tract, 88% white non-Hispanic, and very nearby Bridgeport, 4% white non-Hispanic. So we may be, theoretically, I guess, less concerned about segregation if, one, many families of color had no interest in moving to different communities, and two, there wasn't a big difference in the kinds of amenities and opportunities in different parts of the state. We've worked with lots of families who have vouchers and have done surveys of voucher families. These are housing vouchers. So low-income families, almost all of whom are Black and Latino. In one of our surveys, 300 tenant-based voucher holders shared that 45% of them would very much be interested in moving to other communities outside of Hartford. Notably, 55% wanted to stay in Hartford. So that means we need to do both of these things that we're talking about: create access to places that have been off limits and invest in places that have been disinvested from. And the point about the benefits of moving for families who are interested has really been hit home by Raj Chetty and Nathaniel Hendren, who are researchers, economists up at Harvard, who have worked with big data that has shown that for 10 million tax records, when kids in low-income families are tracked over 20 years, kids in those low-income families who moved from high poverty areas to low poverty areas ended up having a greater chance of going to college, 30% higher income. Girls were less likely to be single parents. In a similar study coming from public housing into low poverty areas, the kids and families grew up to earn about $302,000 more than their counterparts who stayed in high poverty areas. So moves like this are not for every family, for sure, but for those who decide to make the moves, there's some really big benefits. All right, so connecting it all together is segregation, zoning, and opportunity. I think one starting point is our laws around zoning in Connecticut. Our Zoning Enabling Act, which is the state's tool for delegating its power to zone. Zoning is a power of the state. It delegates it to towns with the Zoning Enabling Act according to certain rules. And among those rules are this obligation that towns encourage the development of multifamily dwellings to help meet the regional need and promote housing choice and economic diversity, including for low and moderate income households. Clearly, that's not happening. Some of the pathways to affordable housing include increasing density, so housing is less expensive, and government subsidies. In this map, we see the blue towns are the only towns in the state that have 10% affordable housing or more, according to a state law. So we're leaving a lot of the state on the table when it comes to creating more affordable housing. This is where, if we're talking about density, where multifamily housing is located in higher numbers across the state. 50% of multifamily housing is located in just 5% of the land area of the state, in areas that have fewer resources. So not all of those amenities we've been talking about. And then we have examples of, barriers to creating that density. This is, again, picking on a town, but there's so many that could be picked on. Orange, Connecticut, where most of the town, that light yellow area, that's the part of town that requires 60,000 square feet minimum lot size for a single family home. That's slightly bigger than a football field to have a single family home. That size is not connected with any kind of scientific rigor to the need for a certain amount of land to have a septic system or anything like that. It's just the default zoning for the town. And Orange is 94% white. There are other things that towns do, and I have to disclose that I just looked to see if Madison still had this provision in its zoning, and I don't see it. So maybe it's not there anymore, which would be great. I think the last time I looked was like 2 or 3 years ago, and I saw it. But for affordable housing in Madison, right down by the shoreline, for a long time at least, there was a requirement or priority given to the volunteer fire department members, municipal employees, Board of Education employees, other residents of Madison, and then all the way down to the children of Madison residents. And Madison is 97% white. So when we think about another way to get to affordable housing where government housing subsidies are invested, you can see that's a very similar map to the maps we've already seen. And of course, when we look at where families, Black and Latino families are living, again, we see it's the same map. With 74% of Blacks and 86% of Latinos living in those low and very low opportunity areas compared to 25% of whites and 32% of Asians. So I will be wrapping up here, but in addition to keeping all of the benefits of many parts of the state off limits for many Black and Latino families, our limits on affordable housing have also meant that we just have not as much as we need for everybody. So whether it's a divorced family or a single parent or someone just graduating from college or seniors downsizing, a teacher, any range of folks who need more affordability when it comes to housing, we have just a giant void. And at its most minimum, families who are paying more than half of their income towards their housing costs and are only making about $40,000 a year for a family of four, that's still 135,000 units of affordable housing that we need in the state. And I have a few ideas of some towns that might be able to help us close that void. That's all. Thank you.
And now I will turn it over to Dr. Brown-Dean.
And good evening, everyone. I have the unenviable task of following those three amazing panelists, so I will do the best that I can. I am Associate Provost at Quinnipiac University and also Professor of Political Science. And in addition to that role, I have the honor of serving as host for the show Disrupted on Connecticut Public. And one of the episodes that we did about 2 years ago now was about access to beaches, not just in Connecticut, but across the US. And Professor Carl was a guest on that show. And I'm always excited because he is teaching at my alma mater, the University of Virginia. What we talked about in that episode is how the restrictions we saw here in Connecticut also pushed a number of African-American families to explore leisure and recreation elsewhere. So it's why communities across Martha's Vineyard and Sag Harbor became so popular, because these families were looking for an outlet that frankly they couldn't get in their backyard. And so all of the discussion that you've heard tonight about beaches, about exclusionary zoning, is not just about beaches, it's not just about housing. It is really about these broader questions of who gets to decide what is public, who has the power, the access, and the influence to shape that distinction, to shape enforcement, and really to discourage people from choosing where they want to live, where they want to work, and where they want to play. And so then what are the boundaries that we are seeing, not just when we think about the history of these policies, but where we are right now? And so what I want to do in my brief comments is talk about three key areas that I think the legacies of this exclusion should help us think about where we are today and where we need to go collectively in our thinking. I want to take us back to 2020. It was a very difficult period for a lot of us, so I apologize in advance for bringing us back to that. But I want us to think about 2020 when everything shut down and when the messaging that we were getting from everyone, including government officials, was the need to social distance, yet remain active. And the ways that we learned that social distancing really became a privilege, that many people living in urban areas, those living in multi-generational families or living in multifamily housing, didn't have the luxury of enjoying. Those who had to go to work that we deemed as essential workers, yet did not pay or care for them as if their labor was essential, didn't have that luxury. And then shortly after those lockdowns, the messages came that we needed to also look at recreation in outdoor spaces and in public places. So many of us will remember how many state parks quickly shut down because they reached capacity. And I raise that example because at the same time, a number of towns used that pandemic, used some of those state orders designed to keep people safe to further what had been a longstanding practice of exclusion. It meant then that a number of beaches in certain towns, many of which have already been mentioned tonight, would then say that in order to address capacity needs, they would completely ban outsiders from visiting those beaches and those parks and spaces. It meant that under the cover of complying with this order, they could then further deepen and expand those discriminatory practices and do so, as many towns thought, by protection. It also meant that it allowed a number of towns with those beaches who had long histories of exclusion to then double the fees that they were paying for people to enter those beaches or to park in those areas. That was 2020. And now here we are in 2024 with continuing legislative debates about whether there should be a cap on what towns can charge, whether it is appropriate to charge non-town residents double that fee, given that idea of in Connecticut's 169 towns, we all like to have our independence and not feel like we are being told what to do. So that legacy of understanding how COVID was raising all these concerns about public health, about health equity, and about access, and the ways that towns were able to use that tragedy really to further those interests, I think are a part of that legacy, but also where we need to understand that we continue to sit within that legacy as well. The second key piece that I want us to think about as we think about the context and the history and the current impact is the way that this helps us understand the criminalization of poverty, not just in the United States, but even here in Connecticut. As many of you know, the US Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in April in a case called Grants Pass v. Johnson. And at issue is whether people who are homeless or housing insecure, who seek to sleep outside, whether they can be fined for that, whether they can be penalized for that. And so that idea again of public space, of who gets to regulate that space, of how people feel that they are being punished for conditions that are beyond their control, I think speaks to the work that Aaron and Open Community Alliance and others are doing to think about how decades of not paying attention to housing access, of not working on the affordability of housing, how that has created a crisis, that the people who are being most harmed by that are those who don't have the resources and means to counter that. And so that case has important implications, again, for how we think about the uses of public space, but also who's involved in the conversation of countering some of that. So that whether we're talking about the train station in New Haven or the airport in Atlanta, the ways that people are making very difficult choices and still feeling like they are being punished for that. And in this case, not just criminally, but also civilly. And the other thing that I want to say is, thinking about the totality of all of that brings to this third point that I think is critical, whether we are talking about beach access or we are talking about access to a place for recreation and also living, and what we think about that long term with housing. And that is that we need to think about the generational consequences of these decisions. A family that was able to own a beach home in Madison in 1954 and been able to hold on to that house has created generational wealth and access that their family has, that the children can inherit, that grandchildren and great-grandchildren can benefit from. And so when I think about that generational piece, the ways in which these decisions, whether by law, by policy, or by practice, the ways that they have created generational barriers that make it more difficult for people to be able to progress, and the difference between saying that now it is just by happenstance of where people live or where they want to go versus those very real decisions that we still live with the legacies of that. And that kind of displacement, that kind of real and imagined barrier to access is important when we think about what we should expect in this state and the ways in which we give disincentives for people to be able to connect and have access to spaces in that definition. And all of that then, I think, is part of what I see as the overall outcome of this. When we think about the legacies of exclusionary zoning, the legacies of access to beaches, and who is in power and control to make those decisions, which often are made so far in advance that by the time it gets to the public, there's very little room for the public to weigh in. And so I want to end with this quote by Constance Baker Motley that says, "Something which we think is impossible now is not impossible in another decade." And so it's my hope that these kinds of conversations, the actions that we are seeing at the grassroots level, some of the legislative actions, some of the legal actions, will allow us to think about, as a state, how are we willing to define public space, public access, And how are we able to recognize the generational consequences of these decisions? Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, everyone, all our panelists. Before we open it up to questions, and I do want to remind our audience that the chat function and the Q&A functions remain available if you'd like to post questions so that our panelists can answer them. But before we jump into questions, would any of our panelists like to add anything or respond to anything that was discussed by the other panelists? All right, hearing no interjections. I'll go to our first question then. This is from the Q&A function of the chat here. Question says, the statistics only tell part of the story that we heard tonight. How can we counter the perception or alleviate the perception among whites that Black and brown people devalue their communities?
I mean, I think there's a lot going on in that question.
Yeah, I got that same thought.
I think, you hear sort of different versions of that. Often the question is phrased as, will affordable housing devalue my community? And there's lots of research out there, and there's lots of summaries of research out there that say definitively that, especially when you're talking about sort of to scale, not massive skyscraper buildings, which I think no one is talking about building in lots of Connecticut suburbs and rural areas, that there is not a negative impact and there is a positive impact often. And I think in terms of particularly talking about Black and brown families, we need to hit on, I mean, there's tons of research out there about the benefits of diversity and learning. And, we have all these white kids in Connecticut in their mostly white, sometimes white and Asian schools who are going off into the workplace, into workplaces of the future, and they don't even know what's coming. Like, they have not worked in diverse settings before, and it's going to hurt them in their careers. And I think that's really important. And also the innovation and excitement of learning in diverse environments. There's lots of really amazing research around that.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, the question itself, I think, reflects the ways in which we're still living with the historical legacy of how, the real estate industry and housing policies took shape in the 20th century. And one of the foundational features of how sort of real estate and property owner and the idea of sort of, building wealth through home ownership was founded on racist principles of, that, white property was more valuable because it was white, and that integrated communities were a threat to healthy housing markets. I mean, these kind of racist ideas that took shape and were kind of in the early 20th century, at a time where Jim Crow is the law of the land, and racial racial apartheid, again, as I talked about earlier, was just as pervasive in places like Connecticut as it was in the South. These ideas became sort of enfolded into federal housing policies, in which, as we saw with the redlining map, that, privileged, racially exclusive neighborhoods over integrated ones, and continue to sort of fuel these perceptions that, as sort of Heather McGee, who wrote this really great book I'd recommend, called The Sum of Us, and kind of really pushes back against these notions that a diverse community is going, or any gains for African Americans or people of color come at the expense of other people. And this has been a kind of zero-sum game that we've remained locked in, and I think we need to find ways to sort of push against those sort of narratives. But that can also come through policies that aim to specifically counteract the historical legacy of racism, especially when it applies to housing, zoning, and the ways in which we sort of shape our communities.
Yeah, I think just to add, I mean, like I said, I kind of had a twofold reaction that it's like, if someone thinks, well, we shouldn't open things up because brown and Black people coming will lower my property values, my first point is like, too bad. Like, if that's your concern, I really don't care. But it's also incorrect. And when density gets increased, values go up. Central Park in New York is open to everybody and it's pretty dense in Manhattan. try buying an apartment there. It hasn't resulted in a plunging of values. So it's incorrect, and it's also just wrong. That'd be my response.
Yeah, I'll just add there that, historically, who constituted white, what constituted whiteness was so key to this. So we have to also look at the legacies of immigration in the United States. And many of those fears were the same fears that people had about why they didn't want Irish immigrant families to move in, or why they didn't want single Italian men to move into neighborhoods and communities. And I think collectively, it's why these policies, the legacies of them that still live, breathe, and restrict today are so damaging. That for me is much more damaging than a property value, because it not only ignores the history, it also ignores the many ways in which people were denied access to this elusive American dream that we use as a standard and a marker. And so instead, what we start doing is stigmatizing people for things that they can't control without holding people accountable for the things that they can control, which in this case is the kind of decisions and non-decisions that people make around access.
Thank you, Dr. Brown-Dean. And I think you actually touched on another question that I got anonymously here, about what is the cost, the human cost of this exclusion from these communities? And that's to say, what is the impact on an individual's sense of belonging in that community when they're purposely excluded from certain parts of it?
I'll be happy to touch on that. I think that there is a human cost there in terms of having very clear sense of where one does and does not belong. And the other piece of it that I think is critical here, that you were able to have a few families of color who were able to own property in these areas, whether they were white passing families or families who were just able by their own work and ability able to do that. What does it mean for a resident of Madison who is a person of color, who is working, who is contributing to the tax base, who is raising a family in that school system, to feel like their presence there is overshadowed by this? And so I use Madison, but we can use towns across the state and really across the country in doing that. There is also, and the thing that I think is critical here, there's also damage to health, to public health, when people don't have access to quality, well-maintained spaces that they need that access to because of all of the benefits of that. When we look at the asthma clusters across the state of Connecticut, when we look at the neighborhoods and communities that don't have appropriate tree cover, what does that mean for a child that's growing up in a town that doesn't have appropriate tree cover, high rates of asthma, and is then trying to stay safe and healthy amid a pandemic that attacks your respiratory system, or elders who are living in a home that have to do that? And that, again, is a collective impact that is much greater than someone saying, oh, it's a beach. No one, doesn't really matter. It does matter because those barriers have impact.
Yeah, I'll just add to that as well. I mean, I think, again, there's ample evidence to show how, in all these areas of society, how racism sort of erodes and damages everyone and everything it touches. And one here as well is, the environmental damage that was inflicted on the shoreline in the interest of protecting and keeping it exclusionary, which I found was particularly an ironic finding, that you had communities that would be putting up barriers that were actually sort of accelerating erosion. You had towns that refused to adopt wastewater treatment systems, even though their populations are well past the size of necessitating it, in order to prevent more affordable housing from being even possible within those communities. In fact, actually, the town selectman for Madison openly admitted that the town resisted adopting public wastewater treatment for the town, and maintained residents having their own septic systems as a way of preventing more affordable, more dense housing in that town. It was essentially kind of their own sort of veto on any measures that would aim to sort of increase density, and it was done with exclusionary motives. And the end result was the higher levels of pollution and further damage to the shoreline, as well as groundwater. So I think this is another instance here where we see just all this sort of damage that kind of cascades from these kind of exclusionary social practices.
And I have another follow-up question to the last question. Given that beaches are traditionally family centric activities and recreation for children, can anyone speak to the mental health impact on children specifically as a result of being excluded from these spaces?
I think that if you look at the pictures, and I want to acknowledge also the impact, as Professor Carl mentioned, of Ned Cole in this, and what his legacy meant, right? Yes, he was bringing children from communities who may not have been able to have any access. What I always wondered is what happens when those children go back home, when they go back to their communities and say, well, why don't we have that? Why don't I have trees when I walk down my street? Or why don't I have people who are creating parks where I can go and have fun with my friends? And so then what is that impact? And I think it goes back to your point earlier about belonging. Many children, and there are various studies that show that young people start to internalize that. They internalize their sense of worth based on the places that they are restricted from. And so I see in the chat, or the Q&A, I'm trying to keep up because it's Q&A in chat that are popping up. There's a question there about, well, why haven't these other groups overcome? Or why can't these other groups just do that? Think about the generational consequences of being constantly told that you don't belong in a space, or being shown that your lived experience does not matter to people who are making these decisions about what you can pursue. That's not about just toughen up and get over it. There are real mental health things with that are encoded into those lived experiences that I think we also have to think about for not just young people, but what are the legacies for elders who remember a time where, I grew up in Virginia. I know what it was like growing up where there were 4 public pools in city parks, and then there were no public pools because they were filled in with concrete, because people preferred no one having access to a pool in Lynchburg, Virginia, than having to integrate and allow all children to be cool during the humid summer that was there.
But also, there's a remarkable level of hypocrisy in it, because where you seem to find the most restrictive policies are wealthier suburban areas that are close to urban areas, as opposed to like deep in the woods. And it's those people in those areas who have no problem going to the city to work or the hospital or all the benefits of the city. They want that and would be outraged if they were barred from going there or taking advantage of that. But they want a wall in the other direction. So you people stay over there, but let me take advantage of your stuff. And I think it's important to consider that when devising these policies.
Thank you, Brendan. If I could stay with you for a second, there's a question in the chat directed to you. What is the next step in preventing towns from charging more to out-of-town residents to use their beaches? And they go on to say, as distinguished from use of pickleball courts, which are, for example, arguably paid for by town residents.
So particularly for beaches, like I said, I do think there's more to be done. In this case, it was 6 years and thousands of hours and, a fair amount of money also doing it. I would like to see more done. I think these discriminatory price increases are also unconstitutional. And once you have the Connecticut Supreme Court saying it's a fundamental constitutional right, it should make it very easy to say then you can't just slice and dice and saying we're going to charge double for people from over there as opposed to here. One of my thoughts was, I did this as a law student. I'd be happy to work as sort of an adjunct and supervise some law students, if anyone knows any, who might want to take this further. But I can't really put, 6 years and thousands of hours on my own, but I think it's something that would win, because there's the benchmark there set in the case law. And like I said, in New Jersey, based solely on a common law principle, they said you can't discriminate against non-residents, and even said you can't. What sometimes tried to do is say, well, a yearly pass is $40 and a daily pass is $39. And they said you can't do that either. Like, by implication, trying to bar residents, it has to be a pretty nominal, reasonable fee, only based on a common law doctrine. I think once you've said, well, it's a fundamental constitutional right, that case really should be a winner, but I know it'd be a fight when brought.
Thank you, Brendan. And there's I think, a sort of related follow-up question that if a resident finds that access to the shore is limited in their town, what's the first step to confronting the town authorities to change that policy?
I mean, I guess it starts at the local government level, to push on that, because any one of these officers takes an oath to the Constitution. I do as an attorney, and kind of it's like mandated by our Constitution when you swear an oath. Most people don't really think about it, but it actually you do. And it's a fundamental constitutional right, and they're violating it like all the time. So I'd like them to just understand the spirit of the oath they've taken at whatever Parks Commissioner level they're on, and say, this is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. My guess is it's going to need some litigation to spur some change, but it shouldn't stop people from just doing the right thing because it's the right thing.
Can I just add one thing to this that I think it's important to, because we've been mentioning these towns, repeatedly, and one thing that I really discovered, and I think, discovered in writing this book and doing this history was, how there was no unanimity of opinions within these communities. And in fact, one of the things that Ned Cole did was he brought people out of the woodwork within these towns who said, yes, this is wrong. And similarly, even, since my book has come out, there's been folks in places like Madison who were not happy with what how I sort of framed this history, but there were many who, were really appreciative of it. And I think, in terms of sort of, both in times, legal strategies, but also political strategies, finding solidarity where it can be found. And in particular, not writing off communities as hopelessly retrograde or backward or, in some ways, irredeemable, but actually, recognizing that within every one of these towns, there are many folks who actually want to see change. And, sort of building from there in terms of, finding, those types of effective approaches.
If I could just jump in to follow up on that, towns are often feeling like they're in an impossible situation where there are needs there that have to be met, where they often feel like they don't have the resources to be able to do it. So it's not just a question of collective will and resourcing, but I also think that that is why it's so important for the state to make clear what equity means in a state like Connecticut. Is access really a priority in Connecticut? Because the state overall sees what happens, what are the consequences of failing to do so? What are the consequences of not having adequate housing options in a state where, again, post-pandemic, we saw soaring real estate prices, and then the bubble starts to shift. And the question is, well, now what do we do with that? So if this is a state priority, a state commitment that we say, this is what makes Connecticut unique, then there has to be a level of state, not just enforcement, but a state answer that relieves some of that pressure from towns who are saying, well, someone has to pay for the upkeep of this. Who does that? And I saw a question in the chat too, given shoreline erosion, which is a very real thing, that is not something that towns alone can effectively address. That will require state and some federal support and intervention in this. And it also lastly raises the question for me often, what is the role of business in all of this in terms of how this is going to have an impact on where employees live, who you can recruit to the state, and as a person on a college campus, who you can keep in the state. So we're not just training talent and sending them elsewhere, but people see a pathway for themselves and their families.
Thank you, Dr. Brown-Dean. Attorney Boggs, I see that you answered a few different questions in the Q&A section. Would you like to talk about those briefly?
There are a number that have come up. One question was asked about what can be done on a local level, and we have a report that provides some guidance on that. There are many things that local advocates can do to allow for more density. I think along main streets, allowing increases of a couple of floors, it can do a lot, especially when there's some affordable housing requirements that go along with that. There's something called soil-based zoning, which says, let's look at the topography of any given place and see what it can withstand when it comes to just relying on septic. Often it's a lot more than what we are zoning for right now, and that can be done in a way that is perfectly safe for the environment. So, we think about all of the McMansions that go in so many places that could have, 10 apartments in them, and they have their, tennis courts and their swimming pools and all this, impervious ground cover. Like, we have to really think hard about what is good for the environment and what are we regulating to keep out. So I think we can get a lot more creative about our zoning at a local level, but it's hard. We've worked with advocates across the state at the local level trying to make change, and without leadership from the state, which is something that is alluded to in some of the questions, it is going to be very difficult to get this done. And so we've worked on a policy called Fair Share, which would simply ask every town in the state to zone for an appropriate amount of housing that would help to meet the affordable need, not build it. There's these, the misinformation folks out there have claimed that we are saying that all towns have to build all this housing. We're simply saying that it has to be zoned for. Towns should help it, should pave the path for it to get built. But ultimately, it's the regulation and the zoning that's preventing developers from doing what we would want them to do, including units that have a lot of affordable developments that have a lot of affordable units in them.
Thank you, Attorney Boggs. Does anyone want to comment or add to that? I'm going to go back to a question that was posed, and I think Dr. Brown-Dean, you touched on this, but what is the responsibility in state and local leadership, and what can they do or should they be doing to speaking to these issues and sort of leading from the top to promote change?
I want to be clear here that, none of us is naive to think that there is a one-size-fits-all solution to this. I think we all recognize that this isn't a problem that occurred overnight, and that addressing it is going to require a long-term strategy that has some immediate, not just commitment, but investments in being able to do that. So the fact that we don't even yet have a statewide study that has been endorsed at the state level, I think talks to some of the challenges that people feel like they are facing in doing that. I think that state and local leadership is critical, but I also want to be clear that I think the most powerful state and local leadership isn't by the people who are elected and appointed. It is by the residents of Connecticut who say, this is unacceptable, that I want DPH to think about this, or DEEP, or whatever those state agencies are when I talk about a state study, because there are amazing organizations, community groups who are studying this, who are not just saying, here's a problem, but are offering solutions and pathways. That, I think, affirms the power that people have at the local and at the grassroots level. And I think we also need to lift that up, because as tax-paying residents of this state, I don't think we should be so quick to give up our power or to throw up our hands and say nothing can be done. Because if we're talking about housing, we also have to talk about mental health, and we also have to talk about substance abuse disorder and all these other things that people can talk themselves out of the power that they have to make a difference right where they are.
Thank you, Dr. Brown-Dean. I see both Attorney Boggs and Professor Carl have their hands raised. So go ahead, Attorney Boggs.
I just to the point that was just made, we are waiting for a study. There was in our fair share effort for legislation last year, we didn't get the full bill that we had pushed for, really in that form for the first time that year. But we did get a portion of it, which was a study to look at what the fair share allocation would be for every town. And that study is due to be done at the end of this year. So we will be keeping a close eye on whether the Office of Policy and Management is able to do that. And to the question around the Affordable Housing Appeals Act, which is alluded to, and that isn't there this requirement for Connecticut towns to have at least 10% affordable housing. There is something called the Affordable Housing Appeals Act, and what it says is that for towns who do not have 10%, at least 10% affordable housing defined in a very particular way, they are subject to this law, which says when a developer comes along and asks for zoning permission to build affordable housing or housing that has at least 30% of the units that are affordable, and the town rejects that for no good articulated public health safety reason, the developer can take the town to court, and the burden shifts so that rather than the developer having to prove the town did something wrong, the town has to prove it behaved correctly. That's just one tool. And that 10% is actually, if every town in Connecticut who has not done 10% did 10%, we would have 41,000 units of additional affordable housing that would be affordable in some cases all the way up to 80% of median income, which is very high. It could be only for seniors. It could be all one bedrooms. It wouldn't conform really to what we need. If we did fair share and the numbers that we've come up with, what we need is actually about 100,000 units of affordable housing beyond that. So, I think we all in Connecticut get really stuck on that 10% number, but we are under planning if that's what we do, and we're not going to meet our goals.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, in response to the question about sort of statewide solutions, or more broadly, I mean, one thing that connects all these issues that we're talking about here and all these problems, and even some that we haven't really discussed, is this pervasive parochialism within, whether it be at the level of the homeowner, whether it be at the level of the town, or even and whether it be on an issue like, say, beach access or educational inequality. I mean, I think back to the findings in the case of Sheff versus O'Neill. Here, this is a state that has these vast disparities in educational outcomes, school funding, and how all of them are rooted in this rooted in similar sort of impulses that require us to begin to sort of think and push back against those kinds of parochial interests and towards more collective solutions. And I'll just give another example here, going back to the shoreline. I mean, following Superstorm, Hurricane Sandy, how many of the there was a need at that point, and there's certainly, and this need is only going to grow in the coming years, to begin to look seriously at some areas of the shoreline that are just manifestly unsuited for development, and the need, following that storm, to say, these are areas you can't rebuild in. It's not safe here. It is, these are areas, and yet, talking to folks at the Department of Environmental Protection, just how much resistance, how much concerted efforts, both amongst homeowners and amongst shoreline towns to prevent these types of statewide measures to address a critical problem. And I think this is, I'm not offering an answer here, but I think identifying what ties all these problems together is the first step towards then beginning to sort of have a new conversation on ways forward.
Thank you very much. I've heard this, I think, kind of almost touched on a couple times, but is this purely a Connecticut problem? Is there been any research into? I doubt it is, but is there any research into what other states have done or the similar issues that they faced?
Connecticut comes out consistently when it comes to zoning as at the bottom of the pack. whether it's being the 48th state in terms of housing starts, or a look at restrictive zoning by the Cato Institute or the Brookings Institution. Like across the political spectrum, Connecticut comes in at the bottom, and clearly we need to do a lot better. This is also a problem for Connecticut when it comes to whether government investments in housing, subsidized housing, is near high performing schools. Like, we do a terrible job at that. It's terrible planning. So there's, Connecticut has some ground to catch up on.
One thing that when I first started doing research on the history of beach access and exclusionary practices, one thing that immediately stood out to me was how this problem is actually most acute in the Northeast, which and in the exclusionary exclusionary beaches are most pronounced in Connecticut, New York. I mean, and New Jersey, as Brendan alluded to earlier, was a site of some pitched legal battles over its shoreline, and that again I think is something that I think goes back to that another point that Brendan made about how these are densely populated areas with these high degrees of inequality, and and highly unequal communities often residing in close proximity to each other, and that seems to have heightened these kinds of forms of resource hoarding and building of walls and barriers around exclusive communities. In some ways, it sort of is indicative. It sort of reminds me of countries in Central America with just these exclusive elite communities that that sort of build walls and have private security protecting them, and I think we can see kind of some parallels to that in the Northeast, which really again is most pronounced along in this issue of beach access for sure.
Thank you, Professor Carl. There's a earlier question that I overlooked. Question is, historically, there were also covenants and laws restricting Jews and Catholics. Those groups seem to have overcome prejudice earlier than people of color. Is there any reason why?
Well, I mean, it's the history here of race in America. In many ways, how groups were able to claim whiteness, in part, through distinguishing themselves and, through further stigmatizing Blackness. And I think, there are, the types of exclusionary measures, the very idea of, the very category of race was much different in the beginning of the 20th century than it is today. And, many of the sort of groups who have now been absorbed into sort of white America had to fight to get there. And they fought to get there, and climbed up that sort of ladder by pushing other people down. And in a sense, sort of, racism became a sort of entryway toward, that American dream for many folks. And I think that's, something to recognize when we're looking at, how some groups were able to sort of, overcome those types of earlier restrictions and others weren't.
Thank you again. I have another question, and apologize if this was covered, but there was a Connecticut beach access bill that was in the legislature, I think looks like in 2021. Can anyone speak to that effort and what prevented that bill from passing?
I know a little about it, not a ton. I know it was brought up and it just kind of died. Yeah, I would like to see more done. And that one was pretty modest. I think it did allow price differential, but just not like crazy ones. Our legislature is almost like built to have stuff die. You need a certain like momentum that comes and keeps going. And they have this weird, I don't know if you ever tried to get a bill passed, but I've actually, on smaller issues gotten some things, but you'll hear like it's a talker, which means like some people are going to object. So that's the reason you don't vote. Like it's very different from like, particularly the United States House, which will just say, we're going through. Like it's supposedly in this genteelness when things are controversial. It just kind of dies, but I'd like to see more done on that. And I think generally the legislature should probably be more assertive on pushing things rather than saying, oh, that's controversial, so we're just going to let a bad thing happen.
Thank you, Attorney Lydon. Going to another question in the chat here. Sorry, just checking to make sure I'm getting all my questions here. We've talked about affordable housing. The question following up on I'm sorry, Professor Brown Dean's comments. As climate change increases the possibility of negative impacts to vulnerable populations, access to public spaces becomes more and more important, especially in emergency situations. In a state with local level zoning, what can the state do to increase access to public spaces without pushback?
I don't think there's anything the state can do without pushback. The state could come out tomorrow and say, today is Thursday, and there would be pushback to that. I think it's about a calculation of, yes, there will be pushback, but what is the end goal and what is the impact of doing that? And I think when we look at some of the development projects that are cropping up across the state of Connecticut, whether the ones that are happening because they've been approved or those that have been proposed and are in the public discussion right now, those climate effects are critical to that. And who will bear the cost of that? It's not just a local level burden of that. There are key impacts, not just in terms of industry, but also quality of life access that people will have that will have an impact on that. And that's where I think the state, and let me also be clear, I think the state has done some great work in a number of areas. And I think we need to lift up those wins. And I think those wins show us what is possible when there is a commitment, when there is an investment, and when there is enforcement. And so how do we build on that to get to these kinds of outcomes that will have consequences, frankly, for all of us, even if we don't live in a particular town, when those things are not addressed? And so in a state that holds fiercely to its 169 town designation, where any effort at consolidation or regionalization immediately engenders attack and critique, there has to be a way to thread the needle to say the collective consequence of this deserve a more state level approach and not just a piecemeal one, which in many ways has contributed to where we are now.
And one thought I had in using examples too for people who want restrictions is Stanford, my town, in the past like 30 years has developed a lot and is one of the more permissive in terms of density and both market rate and affordable housing. And there are people in the community who are always trying to complain about that and trying to block it and say stuff. But when you just look at Stanford, it's really flourishing more than just about anywhere else in the state. I think in large part because of those policies, by increasing people want to go there, in part by increasing density and allowing more development.
All right, well, thank you. It looks like we've answered just about all the questions that I'm seeing. So I'm going to go back to each of our panelists and ask for some final remarks or concluding thoughts if you have any. We'll start with Professor Carl.
Sure. Well, again, thank you for the opportunity to talk about these issues. I think it's really important. I'll just sort of reiterate something I mentioned earlier about, I think, one of the things that, I think it's important, when we talk about issues like, access to public space is to recognize how, this is about more than just say, the right to enjoy a day at the beach or the right, that these are bound up with, and just as many of these practices originated with broader goals in mind about, again, an exclusive beach enhances property values because it's exclusive and exclusionary, and how all these, these practices that built over time are going to need to be undone over time. And it's going to, there are specific structures in place that were built for particular reasons. And we need to be clear about sort of what purpose they served and, begin to sort of do the, the hard work, both in, in the courts as well as, through, local politics and statewide politics of beginning to address them and be clear about sort of what damage they continue to do today. So with that, but again, I think, this is, us having these conversations and putting it front and center is, a good, important first step.
Thank you, Professor Carl. Attorney Lydon.
Yeah, I would just echo this, and to be honest, I personally didn't really see the connection between sort of the housing issue and the beach access issue until I was asked to be on this panel, and it is like, oh, this makes sense. It actually does fit in, but it hadn't occurred to me before literally being asked to speak here. So I think it's important to see those connections and keep, pushing to make change wherever it can be done. It's good to see a lot of people just wanted to sign up for this event.
Thank you, Attorney Lydon. Attorney Box?
Yeah, thank you. It was really great to be here. I do love the trajectory here of connecting all of these things together. And I love it particularly because when I was a baby lawyer at the ACLU right out of law school, I walked into an office that was, trying to make sure that Brendan's case was actually being honored, and also that was in the middle of litigating the Sheff versus O'Neill case. So these were both things that came together as I was learning to be a lawyer. I particularly love that we had a bunch of law students one summer whose job it was to go to the beach and see if they could get access. But it's really been an honor to be here with everyone, and appreciate all the wonderful questions. Thank you.
So I will end where I started, and that is with the quote again by Constance Baker Motley: something which we think is impossible now is not impossible in another decade. The fact that we can even have these conversations now, the fact that we can think about spaces for change and building and reflection, and to think about the things that seem so mundane that we take for granted, but are deeply connected to these long histories and practices, whether by design or by custom. And so, with all of that being said, I'm hopeful that we'll see the kinds of changes. I hope it doesn't take another decade, but if it is, I hope that I'm there to be a part of that discussion and that effort. So thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Brown-Dean. And there is a second code for tonight's session. The second code for CLE credit is ordinance, and that is posted in the chat. Before I make our closing here, does any of our panelists have anything else they'd like to add?
No, thanks for having us.
Well, I thank you all again for joining us, and thank you again to all our panelists for sharing your information and experience and knowledge with the great group we have here. And so thank you everyone for joining us for tonight's session. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to the Connecticut Bar Association and the Connecticut Bar Foundation for continuing to support and hold this speaker series. We will have more information coming soon on the upcoming events for the 2024 Constance Baker Motley Speaker Series. So please stay tuned to our channels for that. And if you have any other questions, please see the chat for information on the verification codes and survey after we're done. And thank you, everyone. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.